How are you guys doing? Today is March 2nd, 2021, out here in this quarantine. And for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an individual profile on Ben Roethlisberger, the starting quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who's probably had one of the most impressive NFL careers of all time. I have no idea as to when his career is going to end, but I know that as long as he's playing, he's definitely an elite player to watch. And I think he has a very long profile, and I think his numbers and his careers and throughout his career and his accolades speak for themselves. So without a doubt, I'm going to get right into it just to show what an amazing player that Ben Roethlisberger has been and how crucial he is for the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers franchise. So just to give a little bit of background, Ben Roethlisberger, he's about 6'5", 240. He's incredibly strong. He has an amazing arm, and I feel like he's discounted a lot of times, and I mean the fact that he's a quarterback that's been able to maintain such consistency despite is like the amazing receivers and tight ends and even running backs, amazing talent that is going through that Pittsburgh Steelers organization. He's the only player that's been there longer than Mike Tomlin, and Mike Tomlin's been there since 2007. So without further ado, I'm just gonna get right into this. So he's originally from Lima, Ohio. He would get after being one of the best high school players in all of Ohio, he would establish himself as a player that would he said he would go to Miami University in Ohio. And starting from there, his career really kind of took off. In his freshman season at the University of Miami, Ohio, he would end up completing 63% of his passes, throwing for 3,000 yards, throwing for 21 touchdowns and 2 picks in a season where Miami, Ohio would go 7-5. They didn't qualify for a bowl game, but of course they would. They would see themselves performing a lot better than they did the previous year. I guess they won one more game, and Ben Roethlisberger, as a freshman, would be named the MAC Freshman of the Year. And of course, following that, he would carry that into a second season with Miami as they would go, or I guess he would play all the games in a season where they would go 7-5 with the same record. Big Ben that year would end up throwing around the same numbers. He completed about 63.3% of his passes, identical to the previous season, just threw more passes. He threw them for 3,238 yards, 22 touchdowns, 11 picks. He also had 1 rushing touchdown on the day. He wasn't an established prospect, but all that would change his junior year. In his junior year with Miami, Ohio, he would complete 69% of his passes, throwing for 4,486 yards in a season where they would lose to Iowa in the very first game of the season, but then they would go undefeated for the rest of the season. They would go on to win the MAC as they went 13-1 that entire season, and then they won the GMAC Bowl as they beat Louisville in that game. Ben Roethlisberger that season, of course, would be recognized as a MAC Offensive Player of the Year, the MAC Most Valuable Player, and he was starting to get on the radar of NFL teams. Like I said, he threw for 4,500 yards, 37 touchdowns, 10 picks, adding 3 rushing touchdowns on the day. He had 40 total touchdowns his junior year. He's out here setting Miami Redhawks records. He has the most games in a season with 200 yards passing, which then was a NCAA record. He had most consecutive games in a season with 200 yards pass, or like 200 plus yards passing. It continues on. He has Miami Redhawks records for most pass attempts for his career, most pass completions in his career, and of course, in-game records that he definitely has. He has a lot of records at the school. Just to sum all of it up in a couple of words, he would establish himself as a good enough prospect to be taken with the 11th overall pick in the 2004 NFL Draft by the Pittsburgh Steelers, the very same team that he plays for today, and he has not left that team. So, in his very first season with Pittsburgh in 2004, he would go on to start 13 of the 14 games in a season where Pittsburgh would go 15-1. He I think he set the NFL record for most consecutive wins, I think, until he lost his first game. Something crazy like that. But of course, in that season, as a starter, Ben Roethlisberger would go 13-0. And in that season, he would complete 66% of his passes, throwing for 2,621 yards, 17 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. Of course, adding on the ground, he did run for just over 100 yards. And after making he made the all rookie team that season. In the playoffs, the Steelers would end up beating the Jets 20-17, and then they would end up losing in the AFC Championship to the Patriots, while the Patriots at the beginning of their run, and of course, Ben Roethlisberger was the Offensive Rookie of the Year that year. And that would transition into his 2005 year, which of course goes down as one of his greatest years ever. In 2005, in Ben Roethlisberger's second year in the league, mind you, he started 12 games in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would go 11-5. They had the sixth. They were the sixth seed in the AFC. But within the season itself, Ben Roethlisberger would complete 62.7% of his passes, just dipping a little bit below what it was before. He threw for 2,385 yards, not as much as his rookie season. He threw for 17 touchdowns, which is as much as he did the previous year, and he also threw 9 interceptions, which was less than he did the previous year. And once they made it to the playoffs, the Pittsburgh Steelers would beat the Cincinnati Bengals in the wild card. They beat the Colts in the divisional round when they had Peyton Manning. They beat the Broncos in the AFC Championship. And then they would end up beating the Seahawks in Super Bowl, what would that be? 40. And then, of course, Heinz Ward would be the Super Bowl MVP as Ben Roethlisberger in his second year in the NFL would be a Super Bowl winning quarterback in Bill Cowher's second to last year coaching there. And even already the start of a great NFL career, and this would transition into 2006, which would be his age 24 season. He would start 15 of the games that he played in a season where the Steelers would go 8-8. He went 7-8 as the starter. He threw for 3,513 yards the first time he eclipsed 3,000 yards, but his completion percentage dropped to 59.7. That is, I think, the lowest he's ever thrown it in his career, except for 2019, where he only played 2 games. He threw for 18 touchdowns, which is the most he's ever had. He also threw for 23 interceptions. That's the most he's ever had in his career. He also led the NFL in interceptions that year. And even though the Steelers would end up going 8-8, and this would be Mike Tomlin's last year Bill Cowher's last season as the head coach, as he, of course, would step away, and then Mike Tomlin would become the head coach of the Steelers. In 2007, a bounce-back year for Big Ben in 2007, his age 25 season. He would start 15 games that season. He finished with a 10-5 record, as the Steelers would end up going 10-6. They would qualify for a wild card spot, and in that season, Ben Roethlisberger would complete 65.3% of his passes, throwing for 3,154 yards. He threw for 32 touchdowns, the most he had ever thrown in his career up until that point. He threw for 11 interceptions as well, which was 12 less than he did the year before. He got sacked a bunch of times, but and then also add on to the fact what he did on the ground. And then on the ground, he was able to run for 200 yards and get 2 touchdowns of his own. In this playoffs, the Steelers would go on to lose to the Jaguars in the first round by 2. But this would be the first year that Ben Roethlisberger was named to a Pro Bowl, and in 2007, in his 4th year in the NFL, considering he's a guy that had already made a Pro Bowl and he had already won a Super Bowl. He was already establishing himself as one of the greats. Transitioning into his age 26 season in 2008, he started all 16 games in a season for the very first time in his career. The Pittsburgh Steelers went 12-4 in this season. Ben Roethlisberger would complete 59.9% of his passes. The second time in his career, he dipped below 60. He threw for 3,301 yards, the second most he'd ever thrown in a season in his career. 17 touchdowns, 15 interceptions, the second most amount of interceptions. And then that season, the Pittsburgh Steelers would go on to beat the Chargers in the divisional round. They beat the Ravens in the AFC Championship. And then in Mike Tomlin's second year as a head coach, by the way, after winning the NFL Coach of the Year, they would end up beating the Arizona Cardinals in Super Bowl 43. And this is when Larry Fitzgerald was at his peak. Ben Roethlisberger threw a touchdown to Santonio Holmes in the back of the end zone that will go down in Super Bowl history. And of course, that pass left the hand of Ben Roethlisberger, and that is the most recent Super Bowl that he has won. And even at this point, Ben Roethlisberger is a two-time Super Bowl champ, and he was able to win his first two Super Bowls within his first 5 seasons of the NFL. Continuing on, transitioning to his age 27 season, he would start 15 games in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would end up going 9-7. Ben Roethlisberger would go 9-6 this season as the starter. He missed a game for the first time in his career. He'd thrown for 66.6% completion. That's the highest he'd ever do it. He also threw for 4,328 yards, the most he'd ever throw, 26 touchdowns against 12 interceptions. In 2009, he would miss the Pro Bowl, but of course the Steelers would the Steelers would also miss the playoffs too. But once again, these are his first 6 years in the league, and I'm gonna spoil it for you. There's not been a season since Ben Roethlisberger had first got there that the Steelers have had a losing record. The last time they had a losing record was when they were 6-10 in 2003, the season before he got there. So that's another incredible feat I'm just gonna throw in there. So, of course, this would transition into his 2010 season, which was his age 28 season. He would start 12 games in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would end up going 12-4. And, of course, within the 2010 season, Ben Roethlisberger would complete 61% of his passes. While as a starting quarterback, the Steelers went 9-3 in the games that he played. He threw for 3,200 yards, 17 touchdowns against 5 interceptions that season. And then add on to what and following that 12-4 season, they would go on to beat the Ravens in the divisional round. They beat the Jets in the AFC Championship, and they would all go on to lose to the Packers in the Super Bowl 45. Troy Polamalu was the Defensive Player of the Year, and I think this is the year that Aaron Rodgers had asserted himself as one of the best players in football history when he won his Super Bowl. But of course, this was 3 Super Bowl appearances. That's the last time Ben Roethlisberger had made a Super Bowl in February 2011. And of course, this would transition into the latter part of his career when he didn't make it that far in the playoffs, but he was still a player to be messed with, a player to be respected. In 2011, which would be Ben Roethlisberger's age 29 season. He would start 15 games. He would go 11-4 as the starter in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would go 12-4 yet again. That's tied. That's 3 times that he had put up a 12-4 season as the starting quarterback for the Steelers. And in this season, he would complete 63.2% of his passes, pretty average considering what he was doing, or pretty standard for him. He threw for 4,077 yards. The second time in his career he had thrown for over 4,000 yards. He threw for 21 touchdowns against 14 interceptions. And of course, after making the playoffs and being one of the biggest performers and the reasons that they got there, following a season in which he made it to the Super Bowl, Ben Roethlisberger would go on to make it. He would make his second Pro Bowl that year. So yes, by that point, he had made 3 Super Bowls, and he had been a Pro Bowler twice by the end of 2012, or by the end of the 2011, before the beginning of the 2012 season, before he entered his age 30 season. Going into his age 30 season, in 2012, he would start 13 games and go 7-6 as the starter in a season where the Steelers would go 8-8. Under Mike Tomlin, in this season, he would end up completing 63.3% of his passes, pretty similar to what he did the previous year. He threw for 3,265 yards, probably on pace for another 4,000-yard season. He threw for 26 touchdowns against 8 interceptions, one of the better ratios he's ever put up in his career. But of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers would go on to miss the playoffs that year. They would also go on to miss the playoffs in 2013. In Ben Roethlisberger's age 31 season, he would start all 16 games that season as he completed 64% of his passes. The throwing for 4,261. That would be his third time in his career eclipsing 4,000 yards. He threw for 28 touchdowns, which is the second most touchdowns he'd ever thrown in his career up until that point, against 14 interceptions. And of course, after missing the playoffs, Ben Roethlisberger was still a player to be messed with. So this would transition into his 4-year stretch in which he made the Pro Bowl. Starting in 2014, his age 32 season, he would go 11-5 as the starting quarterback, and the Pittsburgh Steelers would go on to make the playoffs in 2014 for the first time since 2011, or I guess that would be 2015 for the 2014 season. I'm getting a little confused with the numbers here. And in 2014, he would complete 67.1% of his passes, which is the highest completion percentage he'd ever put up in his career until that point. He threw for 4,952, which would be the most amount of passing yards he'd ever put up in a season up until that point. He led the NFL in passing yards as well, as he threw 32 touchdowns against 9 interceptions. For the first time in his career, he had the longest pass in the NFL in a season, which he's actually been able to do 3 times. And after this, Ben Roethlisberger would go on to make his 3rd Pro Bowl as the starting quarterback. And I think this is when, of course, Antonio Brown was at the height of his powers, or starting to enter the height of his powers. And in 2014, the Pittsburgh Steelers, with an 11-5 record, would go on to lose in the wild card to the Ravens. And this is when the Ravens started to get really good under John Harbaugh. And this would transition into Ben Roethlisberger's 2015 season, which would be his age 33 season. He would start 11 games and play 12 for the Pittsburgh Steelers as the starting quarterback. He would finish with a 7-4 record in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would end up going 10-6. They had the second best record in the AFC North. In that season, Ben Roethlisberger would complete 68% of his passes, the first time he'd ever complete 68% of his passes. And I think that's the only time that's the highest pass completion percentage he'd ever put up in a season. He threw for 3,938 yards, 21 touchdowns against 16 interceptions, and he would lead the league in yards per game, even though we only played 12 of them in the season. This team would go on to make the playoffs in 2015. They would go on to beat the Bengals in the first round, or in the wild card. And then they would end up losing to the Broncos 23-16. And this is the famous Tim Tebow game, where this game went into overtime. Tim Tebow threw a really short pass to, I believe it was Demaryius Thomas. Demaryius Thomas would take the ball all the way to the house and then end Mike Tomlin's Super Bowl hopes. But in 2016, the Pittsburgh Steelers were back at it, as of course, Ben Roethlisberger that year would make his 4th Pro Bowl. And going into 2016, which would be his 5th Pro Bowl season in his age age 34 season, he would start 14 games and finish with a 10-4 record in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would go 11-5. They finished with the best record in the AFC North. And of course, that season, Ben Roethlisberger would complete 64.4% of his passes, throwing for 3,819 yards, 29 touchdowns against 13 interceptions. And of course, once they made it to the playoffs in 2016, they beat the Dolphins in the wild card. They would beat the Chiefs in the divisional round. And this is when they had Alex Smith. This is when Alex Smith was going insane. And then they would end up losing in the AFC Championship to the Patriots, the year that the Patriots would face off and come back and beat the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl that year. And then that would be the last time that Ben Roethlisberger had made it to the AFC Championship in recent memory. But this would transition into following 2016, of course, he would make his 6th Pro Bowl. This would take us into 2017, which would be Ben Roethlisberger's age 35 season. He would end up with a 12-3 record in the 15 games that he started in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would go 13-3 with the best record in the AFC North. Yet again, a feat that the Steelers tend to do a good amount under Ben Roethlisberger. He would in his most recent Pro Bowl season, because this would be the 7th time he made the or the 6th time he made it, the last time he's ever made it in recent memory. He completed 64.2% of his passes, throwing for 4,251 yards. It would be the 5th season he had topped the 4,000-yard passing mark. He threw for 28 touchdowns against 14 interceptions. He threw the longest touchdown in the NFL yet again for the 2nd out of 3 times. And after making the Pro Bowl for the 6th time, the Pittsburgh Steelers would make it to the playoffs, and they would lose in the divisional round to the Jaguars. And of course, it's funny. I remember when they lost to the Jaguars. Probably just as I feel like it was just as harmful to, I feel like it probably hurt Steeler fans just as bad as it hurt in 2007 or in 2008 when they lost to them. This would transition into Big Ben's 2018 season, which would probably be one of his best statistical performances ever as a starting quarterback. In 2018, he would start 16 games and go 9-6-1 in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would just miss the playoffs with that record because of the tie, actually. He would complete 67% of his passes. This would be the third time in his career that he's completed 67% of them. He threw for 5,129 yards, which is the first and only time he's ever eclipsed 5,000 yards. So obviously it's the most passing yards he's ever put up in a season. He threw 34 touchdowns, which would be the most touchdowns he'd ever thrown in his career. The third time he eclipsed the 30 touchdown mark. He threw for 16 interceptions, which would be the most in the NFL that season. This would be the third time he'd ever thrown that many interceptions in a season. He threw the longest touchdown in the NFL for the third time, of course. Led the league in yards per game, and even though the Steelers missed the playoffs, of course, people were still aware that Big Ben was coming for them. There's a transition into his age 37 season, where this would be the first season he didn't play double-digit amount of games in his super long career. I think up until this point, this would be his 16th year in the NFL. And in that season, he would start 2 games. He would go 0-2 as the starter, completing 56% of his passes. He threw no touchdowns against 1 pick. The Steelers as a team would end up going 8-8 as they ended up salvaging the season under Mike Tomlin, but of course they would miss the playoffs. And going into Big Ben's most recent season, which was a very good season, he would end up going 12-3 in 15 starts as the Steelers as a team would end up going 12-4. I believe they started the season either 11-0 or 12-0. I covered this season. But in this season, Ben Roethlisberger would complete 65.6% of his passes, throwing for 3,803 yards, throwing for 33 touchdowns against 10 interceptions. And following this, the Pittsburgh Steelers would make the playoffs, and they would end up losing in the wild card round to the Cleveland Browns, as the Cleveland Browns won their first playoff game in about 20 years. But I think following that most recent season, of course, I think the numbers and the accolades speak for themselves, and considering the fact that he's probably one of the greatest MAC quarterbacks to ever play the game, and he's one of the greatest. He could go down as one of the greatest Steeler quarterbacks to ever play the game. He could probably go down as the greatest in a very long and established history with the Pittsburgh Steelers, one of the greatest franchises in all of NFL history. And up until Tom Brady's career, they were the most, or I guess up until Tom Brady passed them, they had the most Super Bowls in NFL history for a bit. And I think Ben Roethlisberger has been a big part of that. Every single year, you can always count the Steelers as a team that's going to be a winning team. They've never had a losing record ever since they've drafted Big Ben, and they drafted Big Ben all the way back in 2004. I mean, my brother was barely 2 years old in 2004. That should show you the incredible run. And I think even with that, I think other than Tom Brady and maybe like Drew Brees, there's not a quarterback with a more secure job position in the NFL than Ben Roethlisberger. And with that said, I think he's definitely a player to keep your eye on for this season. And going into 2021, I think if you're ever going to check him out, he's wearing number 7 for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And once again, I want to thank everyone for listening to all 23 minutes of this piece. I hope all is well. I wish Ben Roethlisberger a happy 39th birthday. And I want to thank you once again for listening to this piece. And once all the exhibitions for today are done, I will get back to you with an episode tomorrow, as I do have 2 individual profiles for Jason Tatum, the elite starting small forward for the Boston Celtics, and Michael Thomas, the elite starting wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints. Thanks once again for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and peace out. I'll catch you tomorrow.